I'd like to throw out one question for the panelists before throwing this open to the audience for questions. The question is, why is this so complicated? Why did my first remote computing in 1969? Obviously not the internet. The real difference between the computing I did in 1969 and the remote computing you do now is the nature of the technology. I had a dial-up line. You have gigabyte fiber. But the technology has been around for a very long time. Now, when we were doing this in the United States, we had to obey all relevant U.S. law. That's not so hard to generalize. A bank in Switzerland can do whatever it wants with Swiss depositors. It can do whatever it wants with Saudi depositors, subject to Saudi law. And we just decided that a Swiss bank, if you read today's Financial Times, can do with American depositors that which is legal both in Switzerland and the United States. Why not have a law that says if I'm using the cloud in the United States with a U.S. vendor, it obeys all relevant U.S. law. If I'm using the cloud from Japan with a U.S. vendor, it uses the the union. If you use the cloud from Japan, you obey all Japanese law. And if you're using a U.S. vendor, obviously that vendor has to obey all U.S. law. And if we had something really simple, like no country can interfere with the laws of another, and then we had another rule which says you obey both sets of laws, how complicated would that be? It worked in 1969. Why wouldn't it work now? If any of the panelists would like to address what the State Department calls high water protection for security, I'm talking about high water protection for privacy. Simply obey the laws of both the vendor and the domicile of the user.
I would answer that to some extent we're already seeing that. Again, beside the example of the European Union in the draft of their future data protection regulation, they establish exactly, well, half of this principle. They say that wherever you may be in the world, if you are serving web pages to a resident of the European Union, even if you have no machines, no physical or social presence in Europe, they will regulate you. Now, whether or not you also respect the US law or Japanese law, they don't address. But I would point out that sometimes the problem with this is that the intersection between the two can be the empty set.
I said the union, and I corrected that for a reason.
Okay.
But what I did find on a previous visit to Japan, meeting with the appropriate ministries, is that it's very difficult for a Japanese ministry to impose on American corporations Japanese law because the American corporations simply ignore it. The EU, on the other hand, is still trying to force some companies to obey EU law. But if we adopted that as a common principle, it would be a very good story. Any other panelists want to deal with that?
Yeah, regarding the current Japanese enforcement of the law regarding the personal information, as you mentioned, so we don't have any supervisory authority competed with the accreditation standard of International Data Privacy Commissioners Conference. Therefore, from the point of the enforcement of the law, it means that within the domestic state in Japan. So even if in Japan we don't have any such a comprehensive supervisory authority, therefore each competent minister has a right to enforce the law. So at the same time, regarding the transfer of data, and also, for example, the cloud computing and the enforcement of the law for the company who handle personal information outside Japan. So we don't have any way to enforce law. So regarding the data transfer, and particularly the lack of supervisory authority, and also we are the Japan is a member of OECD. However, there is a transborder recommendation, transborder principle that in the OECD recommendation. However, we have not yet a member. We have not yet been a member of GPEN, Global Privacy Enforcement Network. So therefore, I think it is necessary to commit for the enforcement of the international global enforcement of the law. However, unfortunately, Japan does not have any supervisory authority. Therefore, now I'm considering to establish to the new privacy enforcement authority. So there is one a very good news for it, not good news. However, I think it's a very pleasant news for us. Last week, the new national identification law, the social welfare and taxation, the purpose of the national identification is only for the purpose of social welfare and national taxation. So based on this law, now we are planning to establish the supervisory authority for the protection of personal information. However, this supervisory authority is only limited for the purpose of monitoring and supervising the national ID. Therefore, in the future, I'd like to insist that to expand the power of this supervisory authority. Thank you.
Any additional questions from the floor?
I have a very simple question to my friend, Professor Shinro. After listening to you, I agree with you that the Japanese law or the legal framework in Japan is very complex and quite sophisticated or complicated. My simple question is this: is there any attempt to make it simple and attempt to have one comprehensive omnibus legislation? Because I think Australia has done that, because under the Australian Act there are several principles applying to public sector and some principles applying to public sector. And based on the recommendation recently made by the Australian Law Committee, they have decided to combine those different principles that apply to public and private. So my question is that, is there any attempt to make a comprehensive one in Japan?
Yes, the answer is yes. So the Consumer Commission has already reviewed the Personal Information Protection Act. So they have released a report regarding the law reform for the Japanese Personal Information Protection Act. However, we have not yet reached the final decision regarding the subject. So you mentioned the sophisticated. So such a very sophisticated, it means at the same time it's very complicated legal system. But the reason why that such many guidelines have enacted in Japan is that each competent minister has a right to enforce the law. Therefore, they need a guideline. Each minister need a guideline. Therefore, there are 42 guidelines. However, I introduced the 5 main laws, but main law is only one law, Personal Information Protection Act. So therefore, based on the report of the Consumer Commission reviews, that in the future, the personal information protection law enforcement from the point of such a competent minister model will be amended.
I'm Ray from Microsoft Korea. My question is for Professor Fumino. I just wanted to know if there are any legal requirements in Japan in the event of data security breach, like notification obligations. My second question is, if there's no provision in the law regarding this, what sort of guidelines issued by government ministries you have in Japan?
We don't have any law providing the security breach notification. So therefore, no one has an obligation to to inform even if such security breach occurs. So therefore, however, so I don't remember the exact number of notification which were made to the Japanese, the government of Japan from the private company, the Japanese private company. So maybe over 40,000 notification. So even if there are no law to provide to notify, so as you know, maybe you are able to. It will be very easy to find that at the newspaper there are many security breach incidents. So even if because so for example, if someone lost USB memory, only one piece of USB memory, a Japanese company will inform, for example, Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industry. So I'm sorry, we lost one of my staff lost one piece of USB memory stick. They open to public and even if they do the press release regarding the security breach. So even if we don't have any law to provide such a security breach notification. So how do you think about such current situation regarding that? I think it is a little bit ridiculous. So even if we do not have any obligation to notify and inform such security breach notification. So I think therefore it is a part of the example of the Japanese private companies' compliance behavior and activity.
I have a question for Professor Park. That's a very insightful presentation indeed. Well, you're an expert on international trade law, and I want to know, in the international trade law, is the concept trade facilitation only refers to facilitation of trade for goods? Could it also cover service trade and digital trade? I'm raising this question is because the recent discussion at the United Nations on CITRO and UNSCAP, that means trade facilitation can only cover the trade for goods, the physical products, not service trade and digital trade.
Thank you. As I explained in my presentation, the WTO rules cover the trading goods and already trading services and IPR, as you know, the TRIPS. But the gas is compared to the GATT, governing trading goods, is relatively simple, and also it was adopted and effective in 1995, and since then it has not yet been improved. So, and also, as you know, there is a negotiation going on under the name of the DDA, but it is frustrating all the members of the WTO. There is no process. So I think the US and EU is diverting, leaving the WTO as it is. They are moving bilaterally, and they are pushing and pulling those countries like Korea. And then now I think they are not yet satisfied, so they are moving to gather those like-minded countries around 20. So for the ISA. So I think the US, EU, and partially Japan and Korea are trying to make a rule on trading services covering the new areas such as the data processing. And this international services agreement adopted among some 20 countries, some 20 members, that I think should be included in the WTO as a plurilateral agreement, and then I think it will be adopted by all the members as a multilateral agreement. So I think that is the kind of strategy of the rulemaking at the moment. you to lunch early. So I'm going to see if there are any more questions.
My question is to Professor Park. In your presentation on the international effort to harmonize data transfers, and you mentioned about BCR of European Initiative and CBPR of APEC. If you look at these two instruments, they are quite different. BCR is for within companies, and CBPR is, between nations. Are you optimistic that this is something that can be synergized? And my second question is open to all panelists. Do you reckon that there is a need for, a very simplistic question, do you reckon that there is a need for the United Nations to come up with something on this?
I think the harmonization of the rules on international data transfers are good both to businesses and also consumers. And also, it is a good thing at the moment to see that the two sides, the EU and the APEC, although APEC is not the international organization, just a grouping of countries as such, but they now understand a need for the harmonization for those businesses working both in the EU and also in APEC economies. So I'm not sure whether I'm positive or not, but I think it is in the beginning, and somehow I think there will be some result.
I thought Professor Park's presentation was very interesting, especially about the efforts of harmonization going on within APEC. I've spent a lot of time in the last few months speaking to European regulators, both at the national level and in Brussels. I think, first of all, they would say that binding corporate rules already work today for a multinational in Japan or anywhere else in Asia that has operations in the EU. There's something else, there's something called model clauses for relationships between corporations instead of within a group. I also think the EU probably would not change its rules regardless of arrangements, discussions between the EU and APEC. The binding corporate rules and the model clauses are going to remain in place. You do have one example, though. You have a very prominent example of Safe Harbor, which was negotiated between the U.S. Department of Commerce and the EU, which is basically a self-certification program, very similar in intent to binding corporate rules, where U.S. companies voluntarily commit themselves to legally binding and legally enforceable rules that meet the European standards. And I think the Europeans, unlike the Asian countries, have no difficulty regulating American firms, even if those American firms sometimes claim that they're not subject to European law. Europe's advantage over Asia is that it is a unified market already, and has been for some time. So they have tremendous power to, in effect, deny access to their market if a Google or a Facebook doesn't play by their rules. And in fact, they're extremely conscious of this. They say it openly. We know that we don't have our own native European firms, leaders in the world, but we will close our market to you if you don't obey our rules. And they're also very conscious of the fact that they're regulating Facebook and Google for the rest of the world. I mean, the Irish Data Commissioner just spent a year investigating Facebook in depth. And he said to me, a few weeks ago, I know I'm regulating Facebook for Japan and India and Korea, because in effect, Facebook's international operations are based in Dublin. They're not, probably from a practical point of view, once they comply with the European requirements, which they have done, they're probably not going to do things differently in the rest of the world outside of the United States. So in practice, the Europeans are already regulating Facebook for you. If that's good or bad, I don't know. I can't say.
One last question for the panel. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you wanted it, of course.
I didn't mention one thing in my presentation. I'm a professor of law, and I'm looking at those international relations from the point of law, and I see these kind of things I mentioned as kind of rules rivalry between countries. And as we mentioned, in respect of privacy, EU has been regarded as dominating in a sense, and the U.S. privacy law is regarded rather weak. But it's interesting to see that so with the APEC privacy framework and also especially the cross-border privacy rules were initiated by the U.S. So now the EU and APEC, but I think not the APEC itself, but I think in reality the U.S. So I think the U.S. and EU are now competing or not competing, rather they're harmonizing the rules over the international data transfer in respect of privacy. So I'm looking at how it will go, interestingly.
I'm sorry for having interrupted you. Very simple last question. When the consumers don't have transparency, they really don't know what they're buying. So in the United States, we had a Food and Drug Administration for over 100 years because, much as the first keynote speaker said, when you buy something from a neighbor, you know what you're eating. When you buy something from a remote factory, you have no idea what you're getting. Now, the idea of a digital butler, a digital assistant, is really very attractive. But I think, as Jeff pointed out, if the butler is paid for recommendations, you have a real interesting conflict of interest. The butler should give you something that is at least good enough for you. But it should probably, without regulation, give you what's most profitable for the butler. So I had a travel agent in Philadelphia who was spectacularly successful because he had the airlines bid for which customers they got. And flights you got were not necessarily the flights that were best for you. They were good enough for you and most profitable for the travel agent. So the question is, without transparency, can you even have competition for services that look like they're free, but in fact are paid by someone else, perhaps to compromise the quality of what you're offered? A very simple question. Do we need, just like we have a Food and Drug Administration, just like every company regulates the safety of automobiles, do we need to regulate the safety of digital butlers and digital recommenders? Take it, guys, take it.
Certainly, yes. I mean, it's absolutely in the tradition, both in the United States and Europe, and I believe in Asia, consumer regulation. If you buy insurance, life insurance, it's regulated. If you buy a house, it's regulated. Again, I mean, the Federal Trade Commission is created to ensure that transactions are fair and not deceptive. And I think that's exactly what Eric is talking about. What is the true price of free? And obviously there's behavioral economics and the theory of transaction costs show that these things are not free. You're paying in the coin of privacy, which is okay, providing that you are informed and that you consent and that you are able to consent because you're not a child or you're not an employee of an organization. So I think, yes, absolutely.
But you may also be paying in terms of compromised quality of recommendation, and that's more dangerous because you have no way of knowing about it.
Absolutely.
I know two of my colleagues in the United States, Oren Braha and Frank Pasquale, suggested a federal search commission, and the response was loud laughter because, of course, this is an invasion of the Internet's right to do whatever it wants. Do you think laughter is an appropriate response? Anyone? I think the silence as a response to that question is absolutely terrifying because we're talking about the law, and the question I've just asked is what do you want the law to do? And until you can answer that question, until you know what transparency, quality, and consent mean, your law is 1890 telecommunications law, not 2020 telecommunications law. A horrible thing to say last. Please ask the question.
I just want to ask two simple questions. The first question is to Dr. Fumio. Is that privacy mark system relevant, coherent, or maybe almost similar with the accountability agent in the Act Privacy Fact Finders? They are on the independent provision of doing that. Is that the same or not? Second one is, if the customers, or to the open the analyst, if the customer have a right to choose to interact with a provider of cloud computing, and if the recommendation is minimize the government's influence or intervention for that, who can guarantee that the right to be forgotten or someone had already taken out from the providers that implement effectively right to be forgotten? Who can guarantee that the providers will delete all the personal data that have already before? Thank you.
Regarding that question regarding the privacy mark system, the accreditation privacy system is it requires a third party accreditation system. Therefore, any privacy pathfinder project is similar to this framework. Maybe in the future, the privacy mark system will be a part of such a third party accreditation system. So therefore, it's similar. It's not just similar. It is in the future based on the privacy mark system is based on Japanese industrial law, JIS, Japanese Industrial System. So it is called the JIS GIS. So it is only the voluntary effort by the private company. However, the accreditation system is based on the law. So this is my answer.
I would answer the second part about the right to be forgotten. But first, I would answer Eric's question. I absolutely think this should be regulated in the sense that free, fair, and non-deceptive transactions certainly require me as a consumer to be informed if I'm paying for a free service by being a victim of price discrimination. And I think that's not a new idea. I think it's already accepted and implemented in regulations in many other areas, and it absolutely should be translated into the digital arena. That's just my opinion. And I think that regulators, and certainly in the US and Europe, tend to agree, maybe more so in Europe than in the US, but we'll see. With respect to the right to be forgotten, which refers to a very controversial provision in the draft EU data protection regulation, I think they would tell you that the defenders of this provision who wrote it in the EC would tell you, look, don't worry, they understand. Look, literally, the answer to your question is no, it cannot be guaranteed, it cannot be enforced. They understand that. They say that it will be enforced pragmatically, and there are many exceptions. For example, if it's a fact that you did something, you may not be able to erase that. So, but the technical question is, it cannot be guaranteed, and I think they will, in practice, back away from the rather sensational media portrayal of the right to be forgotten that we've all read about. That's my guess.
We can take one more question, but we don't have to.
I mean, right to be forgotten has become very popular, as mentioned by the draft, the general data protection regulation in the EU. But in a sense, in Korea, we have the law, PIPA. It was effective in 2 years ago. And we have the provision on the data subject right to erase. And I think it is very similar to the provisions provided in the draft. But so I think that idea is not so new, I think, but as you mentioned, there is, technical and practical, difficulty in how to implement.
From where I sit, the right to be forgotten does not exist. As a joke from time to time, I will check to see what the earliest things I can find are about myself. And in 1967, I led a food strike at MIT. And the MIT newspaper was subsequently digitized through scanning. And I found that the reconciliation between myself and the administration was a permanent record of the internet. I think what you need to have is a right to be forgiven. In other words, you cannot be forgotten. It will be there. But you actually need legislation that says the government cannot use this in hiring. It cannot use this in any form of allocation of jobs. And that employers cannot either. Forgotten doesn't exist. Forgiven is the best you can hope for. And with that, that's how much.